Hello, I am Alaysia Black Hackett, Chief Diversity and Equity Officer at the Department of Labor. For a visual description of myself, I am a Black woman with black hair, and today I am wearing red. I use she, her pronouns. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with Assistant Secretary Carolyn Angus-Hornbuckle. The Department of Labor has had the honor of celebrating National Native American Heritage Month this November and is more committed than ever to recognize and uplift the contributions of Native Indigenous people in America this month and beyond. Hello, Carolyn. Thank you for joining me today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Alaysia. Yes, I'd love to take a minute, and especially given that it is Native American Heritage Month, I'm excited to share a little bit about myself, including my visual description. I'm a Native American woman. Today, I'm wearing blue glasses. I'm wearing a green sweater, and I'm joining you from my office here at the Department of Labor. I mentioned my tribal affiliation, and I'll just go into a little bit more detail. I actually have a Mohawk tribal affiliation, and my two grandmothers are Mohawk. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm just really delighted to have this conversation with you today.
Many of us across the department have been working hard to implement DOL's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility strategic plan. As we work to advance and embed these critically important values, it's clear that inclusion is the key to meaningful and lasting change. During Native American Heritage Month, we have an opportunity to better understand tribal nations, tribal people, and Native practices. Carolyn, you and I have had a chance to discuss some of the practices that Native organizations use in the workplace. Can you share a little bit here about those practices and how they might benefit any workplace?
Sure, I would love to. So there are many different examples I could highlight, but from my experience and background in working with tribal communities, I saw some really distinctive practices that I thought were very interesting and would be things that people in our audience might be interested in learning about. And these were practices that were part of meetings. So, in many tribal meetings, people are coming together and oftentimes across great distances to work on common issues and find solutions to problems. And many of those gatherings started with prayers. So, if you haven't been to a tribal meeting where you've experienced this, it is a really interesting and valuable ritual. It's interesting to see how it works, and certainly very interesting to hear what tribal leaders typically would share. But it also has such a functional um, purpose in a meeting where you are bringing people together. Starting with a prayer, participants in a meeting would have a few moments to center themselves, often after their travel, and they would have an opportunity to reflect on why they're there at that meeting, at that gathering. And they also have a chance to reflect on what they hope will happen. So, in that few moments at the beginning of a meeting, it really provides an opportunity for people to just stop and ground themselves and think about their purpose and tap into their mission. Oftentimes in those prayers, a tribal leader or another person in the meeting, sometimes it's not a tribal leader, sometimes it's a person who is part of an organization and a leader. Oftentimes that person who is giving the prayer would also acknowledge the work of those that came before them and the work that would be ongoing after the meeting, perhaps even into the next generation. That was part of what I saw with the work that I did in tribal communities, with tribal nations and tribal organizations. And in all of those ways, participants really gathered their strength and their knowledge and their and built their partnerships for the work ahead. So these were some really wonderful ways to start a meeting and start on an important task. Now at the department, I think that I have not started meetings with prayers, but I've certainly kind of adapted that practice a bit and adopted it in some of the meetings that I hold. And one of the things that I try and do at the start of meetings is acknowledge people's participation in the task thus far, and to really appreciate and be grateful for the work that has already gone before, and the willingness of the folks around the table to continue the work and to do their best work. So that was one area I wanted to show as an example. Another practice that I saw frequently in tribal meetings that I think can probably inform some of the work that we do at the department is really intentional listening and a respect for speakers. And I know in many different cultures, this is something that is very, very important to people. But in tribal cultures, you might even see at a tribal meeting, the participants using a physical representation, which reminds us about intentional listening and respect for speakers. For example, some tribes use a talking stick. So when the speaker is holding the talking stick, this means that that person has the floor. It means that they are going to share important words and important ideas, and that everyone around the table or around the room should really listen intently and seek to understand. Now, again, this is not something that I have used in terms of using a physical object, but I try to really foster that intentional listening and deep respect for what those around me in meetings are trying to share, and really working hard to seek to understand the frame that they're coming with and their perspective, and asking questions, and really giving people the time to develop their thought. So these are just a couple of things that I saw very much in meetings and in gatherings when tribal folks were coming together. And I know we do a lot of meetings here at the department. So these are things that we might want to think about and make space for.
We have been having many discussions at the department about how we can make our time together in person more meaningful. How do Native organizations create meaningful engagement?
So I think that that's a great question. And a couple of examples that I will share are also things that you might see in a meeting or a gathering. One of the things that I frequently saw when I was working in tribal spaces is that in a meeting where people did not know each other or did not know each other well, there was always some time set aside for people to actually introduce themselves and share where they were from, share a little bit about themselves. And although this took time away from perhaps the business portions of the meeting, it was very intentionally done and with a particular purpose in mind. And the idea that I understood was underlying this practice was to make sure that people could really know the other people in the meeting, and that they could have a personal relationship and build that collaboration and a partnership that might really be required for many years to come. As some of those who are watching this session might know, some of the issues and challenges that tribal communities face, these are often generational challenges. They're things that did not happen quickly, and we know the solutions will take many years. So when you bring people together and you're working on common problems and challenges together, and you know that this work will take time, you really must build those relationships for the long term, and getting to know each other better that's like a first step in making sure that you have those partnerships in place for that work to come. Another thing that I think kind of follows along in that same general area is in many tribal meetings and tribal events. I was privileged to also learn about the culture of oftentimes the hosting tribe. So a tribe would be hosting a meeting and people would be gathered again, like I said before, probably from places far away, and they would come together, they would do a work session, but they would also usually build in some time for people to take a break from the meeting, get to know the hosting tribe's culture, and to really enjoy that culture. And through that, get to know that tribe's perspective. And oftentimes, tribes would take turns hosting those meetings. So, as you worked on a particular initiative, you would get a chance to really meet all of the participants and stakeholders and learn a little bit about their culture and where they were coming from. So sometimes that cultural sharing would be storytelling, or it might be hearing a tribal song, or seeing a tribal dance, or sharing in a meal of traditional food, or perhaps playing a game. And through those interactions, you really got to know each other better. You got to know what was important to the folks that were around the table in that meeting doing that work. And of course, it's great fun, and you got a chance to build friendships and relationships that would be for the long term.
I appreciate you sharing those examples, Carolyn. You are highlighting some best practices that we could adapt and adopt here at the Department of Labor. How do we cultivate a workplace that makes space for diverse practices, knowing that if we don't make space, we could be missing out on our approaches that work?
I think that's a great question, Alaysia. And it's one that tribal entities and organizations face too. So there are more than 600 tribal nations. Some are federally recognized, some are state recognized. They stretch from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific Ocean. So you have a lot of diversity just geographically. And then furthermore, each of those nations is unique. They have their own history, they have their own cultural practices, they have their own languages. And yet, because of their shared history, tribes are often working together, especially in the federal policy space. So they come together as individual nations, and together they ensure that the federal government honors the government to government relationship. And as they come together, they need to find ways to work together and make space for very diverse perspectives, practices, and approaches. Some of the most impressive examples that I've seen of inclusion and cooperation are when tribes lift up the values of mutual respect. So these are things like honest and respectful dialogue, respectful curiosity, like certainly asking questions, but being very tuned in to if your question and your curiosity is calibrated correctly. And really, overall, just being respectful and working towards seeking understanding and setting the stage for really productive sharing. When you create a safe space for this type of sharing and being honest with others about your goals and concerns, you can do a lot of great work. So that's one of the things that I've seen tribal nations do. And I think that it's, again, a practice that we can probably use and adapt and adopt for the work that we do at the Department of Labor.
I am glad you shared a little bit about the diversity of tribal nations and the government to government relationship. As federal employees, how can we help foster the government to government relationship with tribal nations and the federal government? And how can we better support Native colleagues?
So I think there are several actions that we can take. We can educate ourselves and our colleagues about Native American history, culture, and contemporary issues. And when we do this, we can help reduce stereotypes and misconceptions and biases. And in doing this education work, we can invite Native speakers, cultural experts, and tribal representatives to share their knowledge and their experiences. This would provide some valuable insight and promote cultural awareness to all of our employees. And I think sometimes people really enjoy sharing things that are important to them. So it's a win-win all around. We can also establish mentorship programs and support networks specifically for tribal employees. One of the things that I know people in my past experience, lots of tribal representation happens in Washington, D.C., and especially for our tribal employees that might be in Washington, D.C. Sometimes the city can be a little bit different from where their communities are, where their tribal nations are located. And I think certainly having support networks and affinity groups really make a big agency like the Department of Labor a little bit smaller, a little bit more intimate, and just a little bit more welcoming. So these are some of the things that I think that we can do to make our workplace a model workplace and more inclusive. We can also offer guidance, networking opportunities, and a safe space for discussing challenges. Our managers and supervisors can and should ensure that our workplace policies are inclusive and accommodating to the needs of all of our employees, including Native and tribal workers. I will also mention that as federal employees, we have a responsibility to honor the government to government relationship, which is the relationship that the federal government has with tribal nations. So as we learn about tribal history, the individual tribes that we are working with, that the Department of Labor is working with, and also just the larger federal Indian policy, we inform ourselves and we make sure that the federal government honors the commitments that we've made to tribal nations and tribal people. So for all those reasons, I think that the activities and the practices that we've talked about are both provide a great opportunity for the department and also an opportunity for us to honor our commitment to tribes.
Thank you so much for those tangible steps. So, as we close out this month's video series and as National Native American Heritage Month comes to an end, I urge you to take some of the action steps we spoke of today and commit to building a safe and inclusive work environment for our Native and tribal colleagues. Happy National Native American Heritage Month, everyone.